And we're going to start talking about evolution. There are four mechanisms of evolution, meaning four different ways that we know evolution works. And then one of those is natural selection. It's probably the one you're most familiar with. Give you a couple examples of that, and then we'll talk about what the word theory means for a scientist. In your roadmap, we are talking about evolution. Here are the big ideas again. Information is exchanged among biological organisms. Information comes in all kinds of sizes. Evolution is a guiding force in all biology. All cells come from other cells, and organisms are made of cells. Homeostasis is a property of cells and organisms, and putting all these things together, you get emergent properties. For example, life is an emergent property of these levels of organization. So here is where we're going to talk about evolution, talk about it again in chapters 5, 6, 19, 20, and 21. So I've been a biologist, I'd say going on 35 years now, 36 years maybe, maybe closer to 40. Anyway, long time. And I've been thinking about evolution that whole time, and I'm still learning about it. So if you don't get everything the first time through when you're talking about evolution in a class like this, we don't expect you to. The basic concepts about here's the definition of evolution, here's different ways that evolution can work, that's pretty easy to get a grasp, and we're going to go over that sort of thing. But the implications of evolution and a deeper understanding takes a lot longer, maybe a career long, to understand all of what is known about evolution. There's easily over 1 million different scientific studies investigating evolution, so there's just a lot of information out there. If you talk among biologists, if you survey biologists, there's absolutely no controversy about the basic concepts about evolution, but scientists argue about the details about mechanism of evolution all the time. So the idea of is evolution is accepted as a unifying theory among biologists? Absolutely, it is. But the controversy, if there is any, about evolution comes from misunderstanding in the general public. Some of that is our fault. We haven't done a good enough job explaining what evolution is and is not. And some of it is also deliberate misunderstanding and misinformation from groups that are opposed to the ideas in evolution. By far the most important topic in biology because it brings it all together. So this guy here is Theodor Dobzhansky. It's a very, very important biologist in the history of biology, and he wrote an essay called Nothing in Biology Makes Sense Except in the Light of Evolution. A lot of times it says, I think it even says this in your book, that he says this, and this is a quote of his. Actually, it's the title of an essay. And the idea is that if you look at how things work and what we can observe in biological systems, it makes total sense if you understand how evolution can produce those mechanisms and those phenomenon. But without those mechanisms and phenomenon, it can be really hard to understand why things are the way they are. If you look at the human back, the source of lots of back pain in humans, you could think of maybe a different design that would result in less back pain. But once you understand how that back evolved in the ancestors that led up to humans, it makes total sense about why it is the way it is. Okay, so all encompassing, we'll talk about evolutionary theory. And a scientist uses the word theory in a different way than a non-scientist uses the word. For a scientist, when someone is saying this is an evolutionary theory, it is an explanation for the best explanation for all the data we have, all the experiments, all the results of all those experiments, interpreting all those experiments in light of one common unifying set of ideas. That's a theory. And that's as good as it gets in science. So sometimes people say to me, well, what about laws? Like the laws of gravity or Newton's laws or that sort of thing. Theory is actually better in terms of explanatory power than a law. So when laws are first proposed, it was a phenomenon that we could observe, and it was very reliable. If I drop this apple, it'll fall to the ground. That was repeatable and reliable, but didn't necessarily know why that happened. Now we do. But when those laws first came to be, didn't necessarily know why it was that they were the way we were observing what we were observing in a law. But a theory can have predictive power. This is what we expect is going to happen with pretty good uncertainty, and can also say, and this is why we expect this to happen. So it's not a hunch. It is not used as, my theory about this face cream will give me clearer skin. It's used as a much higher level of thinking, in that we have hundreds and hundreds of experiments. In the case of evolution, over 1 million experiments. And we have one unifying set of ideas that can explain the results from all those experiments. And that's a theory. If you just have a hunch about something and you're taking a guess at it, that's a hypothesis. So in the idea of, I think this face cream is going to clear up my skin, that would be a hypothesis. It's a guess. And you can test a hypothesis with an experiment. You buy the face cream and see if your face clears up. But that would not be a theory. Not unless you did it for multiple years and hundreds of experiments and you got the same results, and you could explain why you got those results. Okay? All right. Some themes that we will touch on when we're talking about evolution is how living systems came to be. How is it that life started on Earth? And this is what many people object to in evolutionary theory in terms of a supposed conflict with evolution or with religion, but there doesn't necessarily have to be a conflict with religion. That organisms can be linked by lines of descent from common ancestry. That just means that organisms have a family tree through time, that they are related to each other. Organism A and organism B had a common ancestor from which both A and B diverged, and we'll talk about that. And that there are different mechanisms of evolution that cause these changes that we can observe over time. And natural selection is probably the best known of those mechanisms, but it's not the only one. So we have some fossil evidence of very early life on the planet. This is a microbe that is over 1 billion years old. We have ideas about how life came to be on early life came to be, the first cells on the planet, and we'll talk later about that. And then how those things evolve to come up with all the life that we see on the planet today. Okay, so most people, before taking a bio class, if you ask them to define evolution, they'd say something like survival of the fittest. And Darwin didn't actually say survival of the fittest. and Darwin being the person who, the scientist who first described natural selection. But it's simpler than that, and that is that it's just a change in allele frequency in a population over time. So we've seen this word before, allele. Allele is a version of a gene. Alleles, examples would be like the big Y allele in peas gave yellow peas and was dominant over the little y allele in peas, and two little y's gave you green peas, and at least one big Y gave you a yellow peel. That's an allele. And frequency in a population is just what percent of the population is carrying that allele. So if we look at these two populations, population A over here, and this is a clock, meaning over time, okay, you can see that, when we start off, 25% of this population has the red allele, 25% orange, 25% green, 25% blue. And then over time, that changes. And the percentage of the red allele goes from 25% to 50%. And the percentage of the other colors goes down. Just that change, okay, means that evolution has happened. It's not that this is better or more evolved or anything like that. It's just different, okay, that the population percent, the percent of the population carrying the alleles in this population changes over time, and just that is evolution, okay? So if we look at the human population today, and we look at the percentage of humans that have the brown eye allele, if that changes in 10 years, if the percent of brown eye allele goes up or it goes down, that would mean that evolution has happened in the human population. And that's it. That simple definition, that's it. Okay? Sometimes it's called microevolution versus macroevolution. Don't worry about that. We're going to use that as our definition of evolution. So how does this happen? Okay? It could be by natural selection. And this is what Darwin described in his book On the Origin of Natural Species. On the Origin of Species, sorry. Had a little brain hiccup there. Okay. Let's say this is our original population. We have stars, triangles, squares, circles, and then there is selection in the environment, in that being a circle in this environment for one reason or the other gives you a reproductive advantage. And that if you're a circle, you get to reproduce more often. Maybe that's because you survive and everybody else dies. Maybe it's just because the circles are considered better looking and they get more chances to mate. But over time, you get more and more circles because there's an advantage to being a circle. The environment has selected for circles over the other shapes, and therefore natural selection has changed the gene frequencies over time, and therefore evolution happened. Okay, that's the thing you're most familiar with. Another thing can happen is just mutation. So we touched on this a little bit when we talked about codons, and we talked about how changing one of the letters from, let's say, an A to a T could change the amino acid that it codes for, and that might change the shape of the protein that it codes for. And those mutations can happen spontaneously. Just because you live on this planet, you're subject to things that can cause mutations, like chemicals in a cheeseburger or the sunlight, for example. That may change your A to a T or T to an A on your DNA. And now you get new things showing up. Okay, so over time, this purple gene showed up. It wasn't there in the ancestral population. It showed up over time. That showing up changes the gene frequencies of everything else in the population. Okay, because this one of these reds changed to a purple, the percent of the total that is red has changed. The percent of the total that is red has changed, sorry, and the percent of total that is purple is now changed. and so I changed gene frequencies over time. That's evolution. Okay, and that happens by mutation. You can have gene flow. So gene flow means that you have two populations. They're reproductively isolated from each other. These circles mate with these circles and only these circles. These circles mate with these circles and only these circles. Okay? Over time, these circles may join this population, or some of these circles may leave this population. In this example, some of these circles join this population. So there has been flow of alleles, genes, from this brown population into this other color population, and now you have a brown allele in the new population that changes the frequency of the blue allele, and because the gene frequency changed over time, that is gene flow. That is evolution. Gene frequency changed over time. In all of these cases, gene frequency changed over time, so they're all examples of evolution. They're just different ways that evolution can happen. And the last example we'll talk about is genetic drift. And this is a fairly big one, and this is gene flow, or gene frequency changes that happens by chance. So let's say these are all different colored bugs in your garden, and this is the population of bugs in your garden. And by chance, you walk in your garden and you step on one of the brown bugs and kill it. As a result of that, you have changed the frequency of the brown bugs in that population just by chance. You weren't trying to step on that brown bugs. You don't want to kill any kind of creature out there. You just happened to step on it. You didn't even know it. And that brown bug dies, and just by chance, you have changed the gene frequency in that population. There are less brown bugs around to mate and continue the population. Gene frequency has changed across generations. Therefore, evolution has happened. Here's an example of natural selection, and then I'll give you one more example of natural selection. All right. Let's say you have an oak tree here, and that oak tree produces all kinds of progeny, kids, in the form of acorns, and those acorns get carried a certain distance away from the tree, maybe by squirrels, maybe in a bad storm, whatever. Okay? There's a distribution of progeny that fall from the tree. And the tree is a big tree, big old oak tree, and it produces shade from that tree. Okay? More oak progeny are produced than are going to make it. Not all those trees are going to grow up to be another oak tree. So Darwin recognized that there is overproduction, that there's going to be more kids produced than can possibly survive to pop in the can possibly survive to adulthood. He also recognized that there's variation in the population. All these acorns are not exactly the same. Some are a little bigger, some are a little smaller, some have a tougher seed coat, some have a little not as tough seed coat, some have a little bit more water in them, some don't. There's variation. Where does that variation come from? Well, we talked about two mechanisms during meiosis that would produce these gametes, okay? And two ways that variation can happen. One is crossing over. One is independent assortment. You can also have mutation, where you get variation in the population. So not all the acorns are exactly the same genetically. Okay? And these guys that got out from the shadow of the tree, maybe by chance, for whatever reason, they grew up. And this acorn happened to have the most number of stored carbohydrates in it, and so it grew, and it grew fast. Okay, and it grew faster than the other guys that got away from the shadow of that acorn tree, and so it creates its own shadow. And when it creates its own shadow and creates its own acorns, again, it'll produce acorns more than will survive. These guys are going to die that are in the shade. Okay, these guys are going to die in the shade. There'll be variation among its kids, its progeny. Some will have an advantage over others for whatever reason, where they happen to land, because they got a little bit more stored carbohydrate, because they have a little bit more water, for whatever reason. That means that some of those acorns will grow faster than others, and they will be selected for having higher reproductive success. And so the genes from this tree are more likely to be carried into the next generation, and then the genes from the genes from this tree is going to die out. So it's going to die out before it gets to reproduce. Or sorry, I guess it would be, in this example, it would be this guy and this guy die out because they're in the shade. Okay? So not everybody gets to reproduce in the next generation, and the ones that do, their genes make it to the next generation. Okay, here's another example. So this is, I'm going to show you a video of a stonefish. That's what this thing is. It looks just like a rock, and that's why it's called a stonefish. Just to get you oriented, here's the mouth of the fish. Here's an eye. Here's an eye. Here's a pectoral fin. Here's a pectoral fin, and his tail is coming off here. So I'm going to show you this video, which we took in Tahiti last year. We were walking along looking for another fish, and we're only in about 2 feet of water. And see, here's I'm going to poke this fish. You probably can't even see him in there. And his whole job is to blend in, and you can see he's doing a really good job. This is all rock right here, and here's the fish right here. And he's still sitting in there pretending like I don't know he's there. And he's like, I'm just a rock, so I'm going to act like a rock. I'm not going to move. Okay? And I'm going to keep poking him so that you can see him. All right? And get him to move. There's his mouth right there. And there he starts to move. And see those dorsal fin comes up. Here's his tail. He starts to change color right away. He's starting to blend into this rock. You're going to see his pectoral fins come out right there. And that's a warning to stay away. Now this is the most venomous fish in the ocean. If you step on those spines in the on the back of this fish, it can kill you, depending on the size of person you are. But you'll be very unhappy even if you don't die. I have a friend who also goes to Tahiti with his classes. He brought his 4-year-old son there one year, and his son stepped on a stonefish, and he said he's never heard anybody scream like that. And he screamed for a solid hour, even after they pumped him full of morphine. His foot turned black, and he had to change the bandages on the bottom of his foot the entire month that he was there in Tahiti, and for a year afterwards. But he did not die because he got medical care right away. So, what does this have to do with natural selection? This animal was in a population, and in that population there was variation in color, and the fish that matched their background the best were selected for. You notice that this is not a fast-moving fish. It's just sitting on the bottom. If there's a big predator like a shark, they can eat fish that they can see and they don't recognize as rocks, but as a prey item. And so the more you look like a rock, the less likely it is you're going to get scooped up by a predator and be eaten. And then in the next generation, there's variability among all those fish that are sitting on the bottom. The ones that look, again, the most like the rocks, the ones that can change their skin color to match their rocks, they are the most likely to survive, and then they pass their genes on to the next generation. And so generation by generation, you end up with something that matches the rock to such a degree that it can be really difficult to see this fish on a rocky bottom because they, like their name, they look just like stones. And they've also evolved this venom so that if you do happen to disturb one, that everybody on the reef knows, don't mess with that guy because he'll kill you. So even though they're slow and easy to catch, some predators have learned not to mess with them because they're so venomous. Okay, so there's another example of mechanism of evolution. In the next podcast, I'm going to give you some visual examples of how you can tell the different mechanisms of evolution.